Well, let's bring in Raymond Gilpin now, Chief Economist of UNDP Africa, to talk more about the economic impact that this pandemic is having on African agriculture and horticulture. Good to see you, Raymond.
Good to be here, Rachelle.
So let's start with the main players in the horticulture industry on the African continent and their relationship with the European countries as well.
Yes, particularly in Kenya, the horticultural industry accounts for a significant proportion of the export earnings of that country. And the relationship with markets, not just in Europe, but also in the Arabian Peninsula, is such that with coronavirus causing a dampening of demand for all commodities, including horticultural commodities, the farmers are hit with a double whammy. The fall in demand in export markets, but also the fact that as coronavirus begins a complicated domestic situation, the farmers themselves are not going to be able to harvest and market as they usually do, and therefore there'll also be a drop in supply.
And certainly when you think of things like flowers, discretionary spending is usually the first thing to go during a crisis like COVID-19. But what impact will there be for countries that have already been suffering, as you mentioned, from natural disasters, for example, in East Africa with the locust plague and then Mozambique post-cyclone?
This is going to be very unfortunate for these countries, which is why a number of agencies are looking at ways not just to address the health dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also to help sustain livelihoods. Communities in both the Horn of Africa and as far south as Mozambique, post-cyclone, have been dealing with a decimation of their livelihoods, because when these hard times hit, the first thing that happens is the communities and households strip their assets. These assets have already been stripped because of the locusts, because of the drought, because of the cyclone. And now with coronavirus, they're not going to have any fallback position. And remember, in most countries, the social safety nets are not there necessarily to address poverty of the poor. They're there to address vulnerable segments of the community. And in this case, it's not just the vulnerable segments, but the entire communities and the entire economies that are going to require assistance.
So then what are we seeing in terms of African governments really stepping up to support this industry, as well as some of these farming cooperatives sort of keeping each other financially secure during this pandemic?
There has been a lot of concern, particularly in Kenya, which relies on that industry for a significant proportion of its exports, to find ways to do three things. One, how do they sustain levels of livelihood and employment during a crisis like this? And there's been a lot of talk about providing concessional financing to apex organizations like development banks, who would then on-lend or provide grants to the farmers. There's also been talk about providing direct assistance. But one of the complicating factors here is that quite a number of the folk in this particular industry are undocumented. And so how you provide this direct assistance to families becomes really, really problematic. There's been talk about using fintech as a possible avenue, because fortunately, particularly in the Horn of Africa, mobile money is quite prevalent. So that could be one way to get money to families that are hurting. And then last, there's been a lot of talk about how do you sustain the market infrastructure overseas, because the export earnings, not just for the countries, but also the farmers, are dependent on the markets rebounding in places like Europe and Asia. To address this issue, a number of multilateral organizations, including UNDP, have been thinking about export guarantees, export loans, and also providing facilities to tide farmers and organizations over during these difficult times.
And just very quickly, we have about 30 seconds. How prepared are rural areas versus urban areas to deal with the outbreak, given how they've handled past outbreaks?
The rural areas, I think, are a little better prepared. And in the urban areas, particularly in the slum areas, preparedness is close to zero.
All right, well, thank you so much for your insights. Raymond Gilpin there, Chief Economist at UNDP Africa.